conservative political advisor. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. Rina, it's so good to have you back on the program. So the number that caught our eye, the number that caught our eye, 181 court orders that have challenged, whether permanently or temporarily, Trump policy moves. That's a massive number. I don't have the comparison for, say, Biden or Obama, but I can safely say it is way beyond what they had as court challenges in the first few months of their presidencies. But as against that, this was part of the Trump plan all along, wasn't it?
Well, look, the minute Trump took office, we saw him promise and execute a number of executive orders that were just, to many of us, Washington insiders, a feeling that this was going to be an overreach of proportions we'd never seen. Now, look, these executive orders really signaled a bold America First agenda. They covered things like trade reciprocity, border security, energy dominance. But the big takeaway here is that the Constitution's checks and balances, things like judicial oversight and congressional authority, are what is slowing the pace of those executive orders now. And this is democracy's guardrails at work, not a derailment.
Well, the White House would disagree. No later than a few hours ago, the White House spokesperson, Carolyn Leavitt, was saying, well, this is the work of unelected judges. This is judicial overreach. What do you say to that?
Well, on the one hand, I certainly understand why the White House would want to punch back at the courts, because they understand checks and balances is what keeps our system alive and thriving. But also, they take great issue every time they get a ruling that is unfavorable to them. And they understand that they have to go back to the board, so file appeals, for example. In the case of the reciprocal tariffs that President Trump decided to enact, what those aimed to really do was rebalance global trade and target nations with unfair practices. Of course, we've heard this from the White House press secretary in those exact words. But with these recent court rulings, like the trade court's block on sweeping duties, what that shows is that Trump is testing the limits of presidential power. And the risk here is really retaliation and market volatility.
What to you is the biggest defeat in the courts for Trump so far? I mean, the list is pretty long, right? They've stymied some of his deportation efforts. They've got in the way of him blocking Harvard University from enrolling foreign students. They've got in the way of some of his tariffs. We don't know how that's going to end, of firing some federal agents. What's the biggest loss for him in the courts?
I would say it's immigration is the one that's the testiest. I wouldn't say it's a loss as yet fully, but what we see on immigration is a hardline stance from this White House with really high stakes. Look, like I mentioned, primarily on border security and asylum bans. What they really do is fulfill Trump's campaign promises, but they face the greatest legal pushback. And the courts have reminded President Trump that even a president cannot rewrite immigration law unilaterally. And so what this tension really does is defines his domestic legacy. And I think Congress needs to step in a bigger, broader way here. But of course, with Republicans controlling both chambers, you find it very problematic to see those who will step out of line with what the party wants. But really, the tests of leadership here, I think, are the biggest issues, and they're continual. You know, Trump's vision is transformative, but the laws of political gravity, separation of powers, judicial review, those are really grounding this president's ambitions. And Trump's ability to navigate these roadblocks are what's going to determine whether his policies reshape America or stall in the courtrooms.
The White House's answer is always along the same lines, because there's a legal question here, but there's a political question, right? So the judges are reading the law. That's one thing. And the White House is always saying, but we have a mandate to do this because Donald Trump promised almost all of this. He's not taking anybody by surprise, whether it's the deportations, whether it's the tariffs, et cetera. He promised this, and now he's doing this. And the judges are reading the law. That's one thing. But Donald Trump and his team feel that they have a mandate to do what they're doing.
particularly when it comes to foreign policy, you see their America first stance, but there are global ripples to that most Americans do not quite understand even in this moment. And that's not a slight at my fellow citizens. It's just saying that this is all very new. From freezing foreign aid to withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, what President Trump's orders have done is prioritize the United States' sovereignty over multilateralism. And what that does is reshapes alliances and strains NATO while also challenging China. But also at the end of the day, it risks isolating the United States if legal challenges continue to blunt his momentum. Now, also on the domestic front, you see deregulation versus the deep state. This president has made a huge deregulatory push within this first 100 days of taking office. We saw a slashing of climate rules, resizing the federal workforce through the Department of Government Efficiency, affectionately known as DOGE. All that really aimed to unleash economic growth, or so the White House says. But the bureaucratic resistance and the court battles, like those over the birthright citizenship, what that really highlights is the deep state that he's vowed to dismantle.
Rina Shah, conservative political advisor. Thank you so much for joining us on the Al Jazeera NewsHour. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me here.